Hello and welcome to Weekly MTG. I'm your host, Blake Rasmussen. Today, we are talking about the banned and restricted announcement from yesterday. But first, we're talking about this sweet new setup. So Weekly MTG has a new look. We got this desk.
Shout out to Andrew for bringing it in.
Andrew carried it on his back. He's like, hey guys, found this on the side of the road, said free. What do you think? Put a magic logo in front of it. That's not what happened. But we like the desk. The desk is new. It's going to take some getting used to. I can't just like lounge that's probably better for my posture.
You're very powerful. I think you can find a way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm going to be commanding from my desk over here. Anyway, we like the desk, but that's not what we're going to spend the whole show on. We're going to spend like maybe 15 minutes of this. No, I'm kidding. So we are going to talk about the banned and restricted announcement that was put out yesterday on dailymtg.com. We're going to talk about a bunch of different formats. We're going to kind of go through from standard all the way back in time, whether there were changes or not. We'll touch on each of the formats. We'll expand a little bit on what was in the pretty thorough article, and then we'll take some questions. So we're going to get started first by introducing our guests, who are going to look pretty familiar to all of you. But let's introduce yourselves. Go for it.
Howdy, my name is Carmen Klomparens. I'm a senior game designer over on the Play Design team. You've probably seen me on this show a few different times, but I'm here to talk all things non-rotating formats. And I don't know, it's great to be back. I love getting a chance to interface with the community on this sort of stuff. It's really cool to actually learn what players think about the decisions we're making and kind of have an open conversation about it.
Hi, I'm Andrew Brown. I'm a game design architect on Magic, just working on making sure all of the sets work together and play nicely together.
All right. So we're going to talk about all of that today. We're going to start with Standard, which is an interesting place to start because we made no changes.
Right.
But I still think that it's maybe the meatiest format to talk about. Modern has quite a bit to talk about as well, but the no changes in Standard carries a lot with it. So let's start. The common theme online is that Standard is all blue, red, and Badger Mold decks, and those are your only options, and we didn't do anything to fix that. So address that first.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we definitely see the percentages in a lot of these top tournaments where it'll be 25%, is it 15 to 20% kind of these Selesnya landfall decks. So like nearly half the tournament is going to be playing one of these decks. On the other side of the coin, we are seeing, some of the results come over into the weekend where it's like, hey, there actually are other viable strategies, and people can play decks like Mardu Discard, 4-color control, and still be successful at the same time.
Mm-hmm. What did you? I mean, I know obviously the BNR decisions were made before the regional results of this past weekend.
For sure.
But how did those regional results inform your thinking about Standard and the decision you all made?
Yeah. So at our last meeting, you're right. It happens about 2 weeks before we actually make the decision. But it was really close. We talked about a lot of different cards because there are play patterns in Standard that we are generally unhappy with, and we discussed a number of cards to take action against that would possibly fix some of these things. But ultimately, we felt that with the upcoming weekends, there's possibly room enough for other decks to emerge, and we kind of went with the more conservative approach with no changes, looking forward to those weekends to see if anything happened.
In general, banning a card is something that we take very seriously, right? If we thought that the world was always going to look exactly like the Pro Tour did, where you do see a disproportionately large population of 1 or 2 decks or something to that effect, or macro strategies, then that's something where we are going to be exploring those sorts of options. And like you alluded to, we were. And the following weekend, we saw a lot of new stuff coming out. We saw these 4-color tablet decks, for example, starting to make a pretty cool mark on the format. I'd say, I don't know.
It won Cincinnati. Yeah.
Right. It's pretty clear that there's still stuff to be done in the format, and it isn't entirely clear to us if the Pro Tour is an emblematic truth of the format, or if it's a symptom of it being shortly after the set's release. And generally, I'd say the cost of banning something incorrectly is higher than banning too soon.
Yeah. I'm interested in your thoughts. Let's start with blue-red, because I've been playing Magic a long time. You both have as well. I don't know that I've ever lived through a period like this where it's like, yeah, there's so much blue-red, there's so much blue-red, but you look at it, there's distinct flavors, there's bounce, there's spell elementals, there's lessons, and those decks don't actually have a ton of overlap between them. So how are you all thinking about blue-red in Standard right now?
Yeah, so one of the things that, when I think about an entire format is like, how do we attack the format? Like, if I wanted to beat XYZ decks, what do I do? So I think one of the current problems in Standard is if you try to beat one of these particular flavors, you can give up points to another one.
Yeah.
Or if you try to beat, Selesnya Landfall, you're definitely going to lose to these blue-red spell decks. So on the whole macro sense, I love that there are different kinds of blue-red decks that make them feel distinct and different. The problem that we have is that we don't feel like there's enough like particular counterplay or enough overlap so that certain cards can be strong against those decks.
Okay. And then how are you all, and this has been a talking point before, both from us and from the community, how are you all looking at the speed of Standard right now?
Yeah, currently we find it to be a bit too fast, especially with some of these landfall decks having super explosive turns. And, I think internally we are having a brand new respect for the prowess mechanic. We're finding Standard to be a little bit too fast right now, and we are trying to work with that internally, trying to slow it down in our future releases. But ultimately, right now, we do feel like the format is faster than we'd want.
Okay. And then we haven't touched on the Badger Mole Cub set. I mean, they've changed a bit, and they've incorporated white, and we started to see some different flavors. But how are you all thinking about the Badger Mole Cub decks?
Yeah, so I really like their general plan, where it's just like provide a bunch of threats, attack. We'll see how that goes. We are seeing a lot of dimension to their game. I think Bossing Say is one of the cards that really provides a lot of late game for that deck to ensure that it's not just, here are my creatures, I attack, did I win? And that's providing, what I was talking about earlier, where there isn't enough kind of room for a lot of decks to maneuver to beat their early game and their late game at the same time.
Yeah, something we've generally become more sensitive to. We were sensitive to it initially, but now we are really respecting how hard our lines need to be on this sort of thing, where whenever a deck is, say, super explosive, it wants to be a little bit more glass cannon-y. So if you do end up bringing a higher interaction deck, you are going to win the late game, and you're not going to be ground out by something like Bossing Say.
Right.
You want decks to have natural weaknesses built into them, so you can feel like, all right, I'm tired of losing to Landfall, I'm going to beat Landfall, and you actually can accomplish that goal.
Yeah, so like early in the format, we saw those like super glass cannon Badger Mole Cub decks where it's like 12 mana dorks and they're only just trying to play Craterhoof Behemoth. Like, we generally like that style of deck more where it's like, okay, cool, hey, how do I beat this in the sideboard? How do I change my deck to beat that? Those, like, we like that kind of churn that happens naturally when players try to beat each other. But as we're seeing right now, they're a little too well-rounded and figuring out how to beat a different deck at all stages of the game.
Right, and in some ways you can see where we tried to provide some stopgaps in the format in the Is It Spellelementals deck. Like, great, you invested all of your stuff into a bunch of small creatures and turned your lands into creatures. That was one of the decisions you were allowed to make, one that I plan to capitalize on.
So generally speaking, we were talking a bit before the show about Standard and what internal conversations you all are having. What, for the future of Standard and how you're designing cards specifically, what all are you looking at?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things we're focusing on right now is ensuring that enough cards have clean one-for-one answers. I think if you look kind of in the past 2 years of what we've done, we've kind of made this mistake a few times where I'd point at cards like Prof's Eidetic Memory. I'd also point at Corey Steelcutter and Up the Beanstalk, where it's like these cards are a threat. They also immediately provide their value back immediately. So answering, like using a disenchant on Corey Steelcutter or Profs just feels so bad, right? Because they've already gotten their advantage. So we're trying to make sure that these cards that provide enters value and ongoing value are not as front-loaded or is not as back-loaded, so that it feels good finding answers for these cards. Because I know, like, it feels really tough, like when I'm playing a game of Standard and I have to use a removal spell on a Storm Chaser's talent token, right? It's just like, dang, this stinks.
Yeah.
So moving forward, we're making sure that more cards have clean one-for-one answers that you can go to.
Especially lower on the curve.
Yes, definitely.
All right. Any other thoughts on Standard before we move on to Pioneer?
Yeah, we're also noticing, in our internal data, some of the play draw disparity. I'm pretty sure players are feeling this as well. Like, the more one-mana cards you play and more cards that accelerate the game faster, like Badger Mole Cub, the person who goes first is going to be a little bit more advantaged, and that's something that we're really talking about internally right now. How do we kind of shift more power to the player on the draw? We're definitely talking about more cards like Beza, which I think is doing a great job right now, kind of making sure that if you are behind, you have more comeback potential. We're also, I would say, our past two like really strong unsummon effects with Flood Maw and Boomerang Basics. We're definitely getting more and more respect for unconditional permanent bounce versus creature-only bounce. That's something that we're very much taking into account in the future, and not giving those cards as much coverage, and they're also cheap. It's all kind of feeding into the same issue, and we're really trying to address that in the future.
All right, makes sense. I will note I am seeing a few questions here and there in chat, but I am watching chat. I'm watching chat. Hi, everybody. How you doing? But it is often hard to check what is a question for our panelists versus what is you all talking back and forth. So if you have a question specifically for the panelists that you'd like to see answered, it helps to tag it with @magic at the beginning of it, and that'll help me pull it out of the chat and make sure that we get to answer it. So if you have questions on Standard, feel free to keep putting them in. We can always come back. But let's move on to Pioneer. Corey Steelcutter, you just mentioned. This is a card we've seen before and has caused some problems. So what led to the decision on Corey Steelcutter here?
So this one was really complicated, where Pioneer does not have a ton of competitive pressure at the moment. But in a lot of ways, I would say the heyday of Pioneer felt like the first few months of it, where I understand why Arena initially called their version of the format Explorer, because it felt like the format was so defined by the things that you could do while exploring the format, while brewing, while trying out new decks, and so on. And we love it whenever Pioneer is about something like that. Sort of the problem is, over the last almost year or so, that upper crust of the format has really stagnated, where you see a lot of Izzet variants, a lot of red, and on the other side, you see a lot of black-white decks with cards like Greasefang or something like that powering it out. And this card in particular is the one that kind of does the dual role of explosive pressure as well as grinding potential that makes it really hard for anyone who is trying out some proof of concept or new deck to really get a foothold into the format, because this is able to play both sides so well. We don't ultimately want to blow up the metagame as we see it. We don't think all of these decks are completely unhealthy, but the downward pressure that this card in particular exerts on the format relative to how many decks it can show up in is something that we thought was having a pretty bad chilling effect on churn in the metagame itself. So this is something where, even if not every version of Izzet was maxing out on the full 4 copies of this card, we did see it in a lot of different versions of decks, which kind of indicated to us that synergy agnostic, this card is a pretty clear rate outlier in the context of the format, and we're really excited to see the coming months of Pioneer whenever it isn't having to constantly answer a non-creature permanent out of a deck that is already kind of hard to interact with by virtue of being a pile of instants and sorceries.
Yeah. I am going to answer the question that we get every time we talk about Pioneer, and that I've seen several of you ask in various different ways in chat. What about Pioneer play? I talked to the play team, had the conversation. So where we are in planning for 2027 right now, 2026 is announced and mapped out for the most part. 2027 planning is going on right now, but they told me they are currently planning on Pioneer being a part of that season, or that year. I can't say how yet. Those plans are still in motion. But Pioneer is back on the menu for 2027 competitive play in some form or fashion. And once those plans are solidified, then we'll start sharing exactly what that looks like. But the team knows, and it is currently on the docket for something in 2027.
And it's exactly why you see us paying more attention to
Yeah.
the format now, is we do want to make sure that it's set up for success and that it provides a really fun environment as more people start giving it a shot.
Yeah.
100%.
What else are you keeping an eye on in Pioneer right now?
I think that's the big thing that ideally is going to release so much pressure that was holding other things back in the format, that people do have the space to experiment a little bit more, especially when you look at the arena metagame, is it was really sitting on top of a lot of what was going on there. Best in One in particular was really tough, where it was a double-digit percentage of the metagame and was winning almost a full 60% of its matches, which is, when you get to things of that scale, is actually just a staggering amount for the best deck to be winning. When the larger your metagame percentage goes, the closer to 50% its win rate is going to be pressured. So I'm really optimistic that we're going to learn a lot about the format in the coming weeks, but I am going to say things like Greasefang. That's something that's kind of been sitting towards the top of Pioneer for a long time. I'm really interested in knowing if that's a beloved part of the metagame or another frustrating pressure of being able to dual role sort of mid-range game with a combo finish. I think it looks fun and novel and like one of the defining decks of Pioneer. But I would say, at least in my spheres, a lot of the internet chatter has had a low enough volume that I don't think I have a great sense of if it is beloved or maligned.
Sure. You mentioned, you talked about that deck being sort of format defining and unique to Pioneer. That dovetails into a question I've seen in various forms, and this is a bigger question for both of you. So when we extended Standard to 3 years, it became closer to Pioneer. And you do see, a bit of overlap between some of the best cards in Pioneer, Greasefang notwithstanding, because we don't have those tools in Standard, but a lot of overlap between the two formats. How do you all think about the differences between those two formats now?
Yeah, so ultimately we generally think there's value in these formats kind of overlapping, where, my cards that work here can also work here. There's two sides to that coin, obviously, where it's like, hey, these two kind of feel a little bit too similar.
Yeah.
But like Carmen was saying, and like you mentioned earlier, with our plans for 2027, we are going to take a more deeper look into Pioneer and see what's making the format good, what could be improved, and really kind of figure out what's going to set that format up for success best next year.
Okay.
I think it's also just a great way to start dipping your toes from Standard into Pioneer. That is, it's a great way to start dipping your toes into a non-rotating format. I think for a lot of people, the sort of promise or the dream of a non-rotating format is that you can really invest a lot of time into a singular deck, fall in love with it, and it's going to be good for a really long time, week in and week out. You can go to your local game store and play the same thing, and you could say, hey, I'm a Greasefang player, or in the most recent case, I would say I'm an Is It Lessons player. If you really like doing that sort of thing in Standard, there is a place where you can use those Standard cards in a different context. You can combine them with all of this old part of Magic to explore. Calling Strixhaven old is really... We just did a return to Strixhaven. It's fine.
We've all been around for a while.
But you can combine the old learned stuff with the new version of Lessons, and it breathes new life and gives new context to something that you might have already been familiar with. And actually getting to engage with that additional depth without having to go all the way back to, say, Legacy or even all the way back to Modern is really nice to have that stepping stone.
In this same area, this is turning the lens a little bit back to Standard. How are you all, it's been a bit now since we moved to 3 years, so you've got a little bit more time under your belt to think about that. How are you all thinking about that expansion? Has it been successful? Are there learnings?
Yeah, so overall, I'd say we're mostly happy with our expansion to 3-year Standard. I think we are getting a lot of the gameplay and expression that we wanted to see out of expanding the card pool, where decks feel more kind of like about a certain plan, easier to grok. I mean, obviously, like I talked about earlier, there are some issues with that we're trying to work out in the future. But ultimately, it's accomplishing our top level goals. It's just now that we've seen it in the wild more, we can actually figure out how to execute on those goals while we're making our cards for the future.
Okay. We may come back to that and things like it, but I do want to move on to Modern, since that one is pretty meaty. So let's start with the bans. We can put those up on the screen. Flage, Titan of Fire's Fury, and Lotus Field, hitting two very different decks. So give us kind of the top line on these two cards.
So first of all, Boros Energy. That's what Flage is necessarily, that is the primary target of what's going on here, at least part of what catalyzed it. Boros Energy has been a really big part of the format for 2-ish years or so now, and has really just sort of sat on top of the format for almost that entire time. I guess Nadu is the sole exception to that being true. And in general, it's something that the format has really struggled to get away from overall. And part of that is because of the Flage plus, Arena of Glory combo that sort of gives you, not exactly Splinter Twin, but something that kind of rounds to Splinter Twin from the graveyard hanging over the game, which is not particularly fun. It also isn't something that is 100% out of bounds for a format like Modern. The problem is that that interaction and the amount that it sort of consolidates the versions of energy that people want to play is not localized entirely in the energy deck. We've seen the Blink decks where there used to be, I would say 3 or 4 variants of Blink have basically just become Jeskai Blink decks in order to support Quantum Riddler, Consigned to Memory, and then a bunch of red-white stuff, because if you fill your deck with a bunch of Arena of Glories, inevitably you will want to tap them for mana, and that translates to red spells. We've seen this show up in a bunch of other aggressive and mid-rangey strategies as well that has sort of pushed out what else you're allowed to do in the context of Modern, which is something we really don't like. So that ended up having us say, all right, we need to go after Flage or Arena of Glory. There are some other cards in Boros Energy that we didn't end up talking about. I would say Ajani was at the top of that list as a sort of rate outlier that gives the deck a very powerful dimension in terms of its ability to race. But we do want to expand what you were allowed to do in the rest of the format and not just end up in a position where, say, Jeskai Blink is now the top dog and is also pushing out all of the other versions of Blink that could have existed. Once we have banned a card from Boros Energy, we are somewhat concerned that Amulet Titan would be too strong as well. So that's something that has not shown up as much in the last few months because it is much harder to play online because it involves an extremely convoluted loop that is something like 3 or 4 dozen clicks to net 1 mana. And you have to do that 100 times to channel a bunch of lands and destroy all of their lands, all of their artifacts, bounce all their permanents and so on, make infinite Primeval Titans, pass the turn. Lotus Field is the card that lets you accomplish that goal, both in terms of giving you a loopable way to sacrifice all of your lands, and then also lets you actually combo from the fewest resources with some cards like Scapeshift and so on. So that was the card that was the easiest for us to attack Amulet Titan as a deck that we were worried was a bit too strong in tabletop play and introduced some timing logistical issues and the like without actually killing the deck. Both of these are bans where we are not actively trying to take a deck's legs out from under it. We do want people in an Eternal format to be able to fall in love with the deck and play it for a really, really long time. But this is an attempt at depowering the format a bit overall.
That makes sense. I want to get to the timing of this, but first let's talk about the unbans as well, because we have, I think the internet is split on this a bit, but most consider Violent Outburst to be a fairly spicy unban that can see some play. And then everyone's like, hey, we like Jite, but it's probably not going to see much play. So talk about these unbans.
Jite is one of the ones where I would say it's probably just been on the ban list a little bit too long. It's pretty fun. And a lot of the things that we don't like about it, game designer hat on, being that it introduces a bunch of onboard complexity, are also true of Goblin Bombardment, which has been in the best deck for a pretty long time and is not something that we have felt the players have been particularly sensitive to. So when it feels like a lot of players really like playing this card in contexts like Cube, giving the ability to play with it makes some sense. Violent Outburst. This one, like you said, it's a lot riskier. I would say it was a calculated risk on the side of the team. This was initially banned in an era that was before Modern Horizons 3, which had a bunch of great answers to all of the various cascade stuff that exists, either through Vexing Bauble or Consigned to Memory, for example. And it also showed, I'm trying to think how to phrase this. This card is something that propped up a lot of decks that defined Modern for a very long time. And we think that is great. That's something that we want of our formats. We want them to have an identity, and whenever we have the ability to reinforce that identity, particularly through longevity in a format like Modern, that's something that we're willing to incur a bit of risk on.
Okay.
We think that things like Living End and more recently the Crashing Footfalls decks are things that people liked to do in Modern a decent amount. This is something where we believe it is an appropriate power level. When it was a bit too strong for Modern, we thought it was only by a little bit and believe it is more appropriate now. We also think a lot of the community reception to Living End getting a bit of a shot in the arm with Lorwyn Eclipsed was something that was well received. So if we were to see something like this come back and show up at an appropriate clip in the format, we think it would make Modern a more fun place to play.
All right, so now let's talk about the timing. That's the question I've seen the most in chat, and I know one I've seen the most since this. So this is in the middle, essentially, of an RCQ season for Modern. So that's not that we've not done that before, but we've attempted not to. What was the thinking around that?
So a lot of this is basically us just optimizing for the format being fun first. That's something where we care a lot that players are going to play the best version of Magic whenever they have the ability, or we have the ability to make that true. We are invested in the player experience overall, and this is something where, I'll be honest, this is not great. I don't feel very good that we ended up doing it at this exact time. But I do feel good that we ended up making a more informed decision by doing it here. I would say the Violent Outburst ban in particular is something that I don't think we would have felt comfortable taking a risk on in our last update.
Okay.
Just because the Lorwyn Eclipsed impact to Living End was a little bit fresher.
Yeah.
There was a bit more, or there was less tournament results for us to actually look through online, people playing tabletop and so on. So I think we have arrived at a better decision as a result of waiting. But I do think that it is not great that we did this in the middle of an RCQ season, and is not something that I would like to think will be the norm going forward.
Okay. Is that something we want feedback on to hear from players?
Absolutely.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, this is something where it is weighing the player experience of people who aren't playing with these cards versus the people who naturally went out and traded for them and acquired them to try and play in their RCQs. We do want them to be able to do that.
And it is a tough question because I've been part of these conversations for a long time too, and it's oftentimes if we don't take action because we're in the middle of an RCQ season, then we hear from players, I don't want to play anymore because this format is not fun. And so I know it's a difficult thing, but that's why the feedback is welcome so we can continue to weigh that decision.
Right, you end up in a spot where I know Lord knows you and I have sat in meetings talking about this all the time, where there are so many times where we go, okay, well, the next BNR update is, I want to say, a week before deck submission of a Modern Pro Tour.
Yep.
I don't know about you, but I personally myself do not want to blow up all of the playtesting that happens before a week before deck submission. As someone who's playtested or played in Modern Pro Tours before, that's a lot of work goes into that. So upending the format there would be even worse. So then that begs the question, when does it actually happen?
Yep. On the issue of scheduling, heard that yes, we control the scheduling on these BNR announcements as part of the. We talked about this earlier this year. Late last year when we talked about the schedule. Last year we under-indexed on the number of available dates. This year we chose to over-index. There is no perfect date. Trying to manage this schedule on play versus set releases versus Magic Cons versus Pro Tours. There is no perfect date. We try to adjust for that where we can, but it's not just an issue of, well, let's just reschedule it to a better date. We've done a lot of that work. So, but heard, please continue sharing the feedback on how that impacted your play season, or for the better or for the worse.
I do have one note
Yeah.
as well on Umezawa's Jite.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing I like to always kind of reiterate on these streams is that the goal of the ban list is never to be as short as possible. We also like to make changes where they're kind of more in batches and not just random unban, random unban, random unban.
Yeah.
That can cause a lot of confusion and, oh, wait, is that banned or is that not banned? We just want to keep it consistent. And again, the goal of the ban list is not to be as short as possible. So we definitely consider every single card that's on the ban list every time we talk about this. And we say, hey, is this a good time for this to come off, yes or no? And then we make a decision based on that, not just, let's try to keep it as short as possible.
Right, there are plenty of cards that may very technically, let's say lawful neutral,
Yes.
are
Yeah.
balanced or could literally not blow up tournaments. I would say Blazing Shoal is one that comes to mind here as maybe fine, but in a world with solitude and the like.
Right.
But that doesn't sound like it would make Modern more fun to exist.
Right.
All right. Okay, let's move on to Legacy and a deck we've been talking a lot about for not having touched it until today or yesterday. Undercity Informer from Oops All Spells.
Can I say one joke?
Sure.
Oops, I did it
No,
again.
no.
Okay.
Nope, not doing that.
No.
But we tried.
Yeah.
That being said, so Undercity Informer, this and Balustrade Spy are in a unique class of cards that reward you for not putting any cards that have the land type on their front face into your deck, usually resulting in some sort of combo that kills your opponent. With Balustrade Spy and Undercity Informer, you mill your entire library, get back some Narc Amoebas, some Poxwalkers, use Cabal Therapies to shred your opponent's hand, and then dread return a Thassa's Oracle to kill them. This is something that over the last year or two, I know has been pretty contentious for us to preserve its legality, let's say in its entirety, because it has seen a disproportionately large amount of play relative to at least the win rate that we could observe.
Yeah.
Where we saw it winning under half of its matches for most of that life cycle, which communicated to us that it was unlikely the people who were playing it were doing it necessarily trying to win,
Yeah.
which then created the question for us, great, so why are people playing it in these numbers? And two of the things that we arrived at are, one, it's possibly a great entry point into the format for a couple of reasons. It's somewhat easy to trade for these cards. Most of them were printed pretty recently. And it's also fairly linear in that you don't have to learn all of the possible interactions that you need to learn in order to be successful with some of the fairer, let's say, tempo days decks or something
Sure.
to that effect. So it's possible that it was a great entry point for players, which is something, anecdotally speaking, I experienced when talking with players at different Legacy events.
And we talked about that on the last stream.
Yes.
And the last,
The alternative is that people liked it and thought it was fun, and it wasn't clear to us how many of those people were a quiet minority of people that were just happy to play with their deck and wanted to log on to Magic Online and play Oops All Spells.
Yeah.
That being said, it is not the type of deck that we want to be super competitively viable. It is really repetitive. One card combo, quote unquote, is not that thrilling or engaging to play very many times. The novelty wears off very quickly of what's going on whenever you play against it for the second, third time in the same league. So since the last update, I would say we saw a surge of this deck becoming the second or third most played deck for a little bit in League and Challenge data, which is really not what we want. We also saw it winning a decent amount more, which is pretty tough. So at this point, I think it's safe to say that despite us being well-intentioned, I hope that's communicated at least somewhat here, despite being well-intentioned in why we preserved this, I think it's time to at least make it not particularly competitively viable. You can still cut Undercity Informer and add Goblin Charbelcher to your deck if you want a deck that does something like this. It's really cool that Magic's game engine allows for decks like this to exist, but the important thing is that players who do it are in fact opting into it because they think it is really cool and not because that they think that this is the best way to win a tournament or something that should be showing up in tournaments very often. That's why we ended up only taking out the single Undercity Informer rather than the Balustrade Spies. We do want the people that this provides a point of access to Legacy for to still have that opportunity to play, but I'll say, my personal favorite format.
I'm going to ask a really super in the weeds question, but I was curious about it, and I'm sure some of our viewers who play Legacy may have thoughts too. So the reason, as you all were talking about hitting the deck, you were like Balustrade Spy versus Undercity Informer. Undercity Informer is the stronger card, and I'm like, those cards do the same thing. I don't understand.
Nope.
Why is Undercity Informer the stronger card?
Undercity Informer, costing 3 mana than 1 mana is stronger than costing 4 mana is the short, pithy thing to say. But in practice, the reason that's the most relevant is it makes you much better at mulliganing in particular, which makes it easier for you to just, this is part of that repetitive thing that we were touching on a minute ago. You look at your 7 cards, does this kill on the first turn? No, let's look again. And you can do that until you get all the way down to 3 cards and you kill them on the second turn. If you have a black MDFC land, Dark Ritual, and Undercity Informer, where you just Dark Ritual it out on 1 and pass with a kill on the battlefield is not particularly fun, and only needing 3 cards with the London Mulligan in particular is not that hard to find, as we have seen with Tron in the time since then.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, let's move on. We're going to touch briefly on a few other formats, and then we'll leave it open for any additional questions. So again, if you have questions, go ahead and tag @Magic, and I will pull in what I can. Vintage, no changes. Any additional thoughts from what was in the article?
No, it looks like players are mostly just having a really good time. I know that Standard is kind of having a lot of blue stuff going on at the moment, which is a bit tough there. But for Vintage, the players there are eating good on the back of a lot of strong new blue cards that have come out in the last year and a half. I know Flow State is the most recent example of a lot of Vintage decks playing with this. Doomsday, pretty nice sorcery to have in your graveyard.
True. All right. Let's see. Next up, Pauper. Mostly we'll leave Gavin to talk about this, but Bonder's Ornament's back. Yay.
Yeah, this is one where slower sort of control-y decks had mostly evaporated out of the format. I know there's been a lot of chatter around Tolarian Terror variants and things to do with Sneaky Snacker in the last few months, but that being said, this is a spot where it looks like the format is mostly pretty stable and pretty close to healthy. We're seeing resurgences, I think, of green and white decks that are pretty cool. So this is a good time to go for a trial and ban of something like Bonder's Ornament. Feel free to demolish me in chat if I'm wrong on this, but I believe the State of Pauper article said that they'll have a verdict on if this is going to stay or go around August-ish.
That sounds correct. Yeah, this is a trial unban to see how this goes, but I enjoy this card. It's great. Someone in chat wants to ban Sneaky Snacker. That was a Gavin and the Pauper format panel.
Yes, the Pauper format panel.
Pauper
You can address all of your feedback towards them.
I can't blame them, but I do love that card. It came from
I do love that card too.
With
it
notepad
didn't even
straight
occur
to
to
a
me
booster pack.
until anyway. Great. It's great. Okay, and then Alchemy, we banned Sewer Valence Cam. This one, head to the article to get the explanation about that. That one comes from the Arena team. Did you have anything you wanted to add on Sewer Valence Cam? Or?
No, my understanding of things as they stand are that this is problematic with the Arena version of VV Orniteer, which is a tap ability instead of a 0. So when you combine Sewer Valence Cam, Boomerang Basics, and that, you end up doing a lot of unintended stuff.
Yeah.
And they ended up going after Sewer Valence Cam because pre-TMT, they thought that deck was pretty cool in the format. And rather than reverting any sort of rebalances and just banning VV from the format, I think that would have an impact on Brawl that they didn't like.
Yeah.
But that's at least the top line as I understand it.
That is the top line as it was written too. And then Historic, Timeless, and Brawl, no changes. So, all right, let's move on to some Q&A. We went through some of those formats pretty quickly. If there are specific questions you have on any of those formats that we didn't get to, please go ahead, put them into chat, and we will try to get to the questions that we can. So there's some good. Let's start with this one. I think, Andrew, you alluded to this a bit, but can you talk about concerns with Storm Chaser's talent play pattern in Standard?
Yeah, it's definitely the class of card that we're going to be looking at in our future releases a lot, where it is a very cheap card that provides a lot of initial value, has a lot of late game potential, and is hard to interact with. It's kind of the trifecta of hard to beat. But yeah, it's definitely one of the cards we're kind of most unhappy with in Standard right now. Like I alluded to earlier, using a removal spell on the Otter, it's not the best gameplay. Also, just like face up instant and sorcery is the least fun card type to be face up, along with the inevitability of the final chapter really leads this card to kind of just be too good at all stages of the game. So those are our macro thoughts on Storm Chaser's talent.
Okay.
And in the moment, I think it can be hard to appreciate the time it takes to steer the ship on something like this,
Yeah.
where we certainly recognize that that's not a class of card that we want to be making more of. I'll
Right.
say that when that card was printed, you also saw 3 different 1-mana creature that brings a set mechanic token with it. You saw
Yeah.
Spyglass Siren, you saw Novice Inspector, Voldaire, and
Right.
Epicure were all in Standard. Now we basically have not done that anymore since then, because we recognized how much a larger Standard format could abuse the fact that you have 1 mana giving you 2 permanents. And that's something that you're not going to notice the absence of those things as acutely, but that is sort of another example of, I guess they haven't done that in a year and a half, which means that we probably learned this lesson about 2 years ago.
That's a great segue. I know Andrew was about to say something, but that's a great segue into this question, which again, I've seen a few different ways, but this is a good articulation of it. Doesn't a larger 3-year Standard invariably push towards 1 and 2 mana spells, thereby squelching interest and demand for newly printed 3+ mana spells?
It does, while we are in still the early stages of us understanding how to develop for the format.
Okay.
So some of the sets that are later in that have existed in Standard longer were made with the old Standard in mind. Not all of the sets in current Standard have been designed with 3-year Standard in mind. So obviously our hopes and dreams revolve around once we're in a universe where all of our sets are designed with it in mind, we can get more towards the format that we want to produce.
Okay. Sticking with Standard, what was there was a question that asked, are there plans, thoughts around doing something similar to what we did last year, what they called the pre-rotation banning, where we banned like 7 cards at one time?
Right. So this year, the rotation is not going to happen until 2027, which is the start of the next year.
That's a good reminder. We
Yes.
we did that a while ago, but the rotation is now calendar year. So the rotation doesn't actually happen until January.
Right. A lot of the reason that we made that change in the first place was because it was kind of hard to understand what was fully in Standard. Once we go to the yearly model, you can now say like, oh, it's the last 3 years. Which years? Oh, every set in this calendar year. So what that means is we had to kind of delay our normal rotation. So normally things would have rotated in the fall. Now it's going to have to wait a few more months to rotate with the first set of next year.
Okay. So then that sort of pre-rotation banning would come later in the year if we did it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that we're talking about. We definitely talked about it during this iteration of our ban list in terms of, since there is a longer time until the actual rotation, do we want to do something sooner? But it was one of the factors we talked about. But like I said previously, when we kind of added everything up, no changes made the most sense to us for this announcement. And I believe our next announcement is June
30th, 31st.
We initially typed it as June 3rd.
June 3rd. It's not June 3rd.
No, it is June 30th, though.
Yes,
It is June 30th. I cannot stress enough. June 30th.
Assuming that's the Monday, yes.
Yes.
June 30th, yes.
I'd love to.
There are
assume
still
that
some
that's a
places on
Monday.
the internet that say June 3rd. June 3rd is not correct. The next one is June 30th. Okay. Let's move on to there's so many questions about unbans in Modern, so I'm not going to ask specific cards because that's a fun game, and there's a bunch of different cards being named. But
one day I'm gonna publish a tier list.
No, you're not.
he was like, "No, you're not."
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
One day
It's
when
fun
you're
to
yeah.
dream.
Yeah, it is fun to dream. I dream often about the things I would publish if I didn't work here. Anyway.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah. But we all still work here.
Yep.
And so let's talk more generally. So we just did some unbans. Can you talk more generally about your philosophy around unbans? You mentioned Blazing Shoal earlier, something you don't think would make much of an impact, but also wouldn't be fun. And so talk more about how you think about unbans in Modern or other formats as well.
Yeah, totally. Something that Andrew touched on that I certainly agree with is that we like doing them in batches, but it is not necessarily about them necessarily being one unban is bad or anything like that. It is more that whenever we are doing unbans, it is with intentionality. It isn't just for the sake of shrinking the ban list or just say, you know what, I was jitty, who cares, right? That it is something where all of these unbans are starting from the place of we think Modern is fun. Maybe we don't and we want to shake something up, but we think Modern can be a place that is fun. How do we make it the most fun place that it can be?
Yeah.
The two ways that we actually have to impact a format are by printing new cards or by adjusting what cards are legal through banning or, in some cases, unbanning cards. So whenever we look at cards to unban, we think, all right, is this something that is actually going to make Modern a more fun place to play? I think another one that is particularly contentious is something like Glimpse of Nature is one where, on balance, that card is pretty fun whenever you're playing somewhere like Magic Online. It's also pretty cool and probably around the right power level. One of my concerns, having played a decent amount of Glimpse of Nature and loving to play Elves and Legacy, is that it takes a really long time to execute a proper Glimpse of Nature turn. So the strip where that card exists but is not adding 10 or 20 minutes over time on every single round in a large Modern tournament seems like a tough enough strip that it is pretty unlikely we end up unbanning something like that. Whereas something like Violent Outburst is something that I would say is comparable in terms of how risky it is, or us thinking that the format can actually handle it, or it being beloved. But if it does go wrong, how wrong does it go? It might be a little bit too powerful, and we might be here talking about how, man, that was a calculated risk, but we're bad at math sometimes, and rebanning it. But that's probably just that the numbers are a little bit wrong, and not everyone in an entire tournament has a worse time because a card adds 10 or 20 minutes to every Modern round.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, the logistics thing is an interesting discussion because it's not something we pull out often, but tournament logistics are very much on your minds when you're making some of these decisions.
Right. Imagine if we unbanned Sensei's Divining Top.
I dream about it.
Wow.
That's why I play Canadian Highlander. Got my mention in.
My oldest published deck list on the internet is Jeskai Miracles, so I am. Let's
All right.
do it.
Sorry, I mentioned that card.
Had Enlightened Tutor. Oh, don't get me started.
Yeah, that card's great. Anyway, so let's. Okay,
Card's strong.
The card
We
is
like
strong.
to be articulate.
I'm getting enough questions about it that I will ask. Obviously, the focus for Legacy this time was on Oops All Spells, but Tamio is a very popular and powerful card and has gotten probably more individual questions in chat than any other card. So I'm wondering your thoughts on Tamio.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly reasonable. So one of the things that Oops All Spells was doing to the format, and stay with me, I understand I'm still focusing on Oops. I'm going to get there, I pinky swear. One of the things that Oops All Spells was applying to the format was a lot of pressure and how hard it was condensing games. It frequently killed on the first, second, or if it took a minute to get out of bed, it would kill on the third turn.
Yeah.
That put a lot of pressure on sideboards as well, for people who want to actually try and react to something like that, because you saw hand disruption out of the Oops deck, you would want a lot of redundancy. It wasn't just good enough to have one endurance or one force of will or something like that. So whenever you open up a lot of sideboard slots in the format and you decompress games on a scale of really depowering, say, the third most played deck that's mostly killing people in the second and third turn of the game, it isn't clear what is actually going to be technically the strongest in the format or what games are even going to look like. It's possible that the format shifts in such a way that Tamiyo is an appropriate card and is just very strong. I certainly respect that it is a really, really, really strong card. But it's not entirely clear that it isn't wildly out of bounds for the post-Oops All Spells version of Legacy. There are a lot of things that we are looking at in the format. I'll say I mentioned a colorless Tron deck I'm particularly concerned about. That's something that sticks out as really surging in both play rate and win rate over the last month and a half or something like that, where it doesn't have the longevity needed for us to really want to take action against it. But in the case of that, in the case of Tamiyo, we do take each ban decision that we make very, very seriously and recognize that we're incurring a cost whenever we do something like that. So we don't want to do it unless we are extremely confident that we do need to step in and that the metagame cannot simply adjust to the card.
Okay. Next up, I do see another question about the future of the Pioneer format. We talked about that earlier. The team is in planning for the next round of events for 2027. Pioneer is on their list, but that planning is still in motion, and so we don't have specifics, but it's on the menu. Let's go into I think this was one poster, but maybe it was multiple. They asked it multiple times. But it's a question that comes up every once in a while, and so I'll throw it again. Thoughts on, we call it the banned and restricted announcement. We don't really restrict things except in Vintage.
Right.
Has the discussion of should we start restricting in formats? How do you all feel about banned versus using restricted more as a tool?
Yeah, it's come up a few times. It is called that for a reason because
for a historical reason, we just
right.
Yeah.
Ultimately, we do find that every time we come to, hey, what about just restricting a card, the confusion elements of, is this card banned or is this card restricted always comes up. And we like to keep our ban list kind of as simple as possible and siloing restricting only to one particular format, the all cards are legal format, just kind of makes the most sense. I'll even break out in 2018, or whatever year that was, we talked about restricting Felidar Guardian or Saheeli Rai. So
we did talk about that. God,
yeah, I know
that
was
so long ago. Yeah,
I know, really breaking it out here. So those things have come up in conversation, but ultimately I think we're mostly going to kind of stick it to Vintage, where I think it encapsulates more about what the format is with everything goes, while also balancing it at the same time, and while also keeping the most simplicity that we can on the ban list.
Yeah, and I think that simplicity really, the thing that's important to key into there is ease of access to different formats. One of the things that I think can be lost on people who have really been in the trenches for a long time, myself included, is that Magic is a really complicated game with a lot of terms and a lot of stuff to learn about all of the time. And the first time that you restrict a card, it is not that bad, but once you are 10 years deep, like we are 15 years deep in Modern right now, once you get 10 years deep of banning some things, restricting some other ones, you end up in a really complicated sort of daisy chain of, okay, well, in this format you restrict some stuff, but in Pioneer you do not, but in Standard, I guess you restricted this one land that one time, so maybe it will come up, but then that card rotated, so there aren't restricted cards in Standard anymore. And we really want to make sure that Magic is something that people can engage with for a long time. And whenever they bring their new friend along to Magic, they can easily say, hey, yeah, Vintage is the place where everything goes, but everywhere else some cards are banned because they're too strong.
Also, the first time we restrict something opens the floodgates for, hey, why don't you just restrict that? Why don't you just do that? Why don't you just do that? And it ultimately just spirals into something we don't really want.
Is one seat of the Synod that broken? I don't... Okay, but you can play
Probably.
4 Ancient Dens and one seat of the Synod. Are you for real?
All right. I think we are going to wrap it up there. Thank you to our wonderful guests, Carmen and Andrew. Next week, we're going to be back with a chill play stream. We took a few weeks off there for MagicCon, and so we're going to come hang out. We'll talk about a returning event next week. And then the week after that, when we hit June 2nd, get ready for it. It is the debut of Marvel Superheroes. So thanks for tuning in. We'll see you next week.